Okay, it started now. So I'm letting people in.
Let me just do the muting thing. Okay, I think we can go. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining in. We're giving it 1 more minute for others to log on. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining in. We are having this meeting in context of the elections that just took place, as well as, I think, all of the politicking, the coalition discussions that have been underway over the last couple of days, as well as last night's announcement that took place by ANC President Cyril Ramaphosa, and developments from a number of political parties as they issue statements and begin indicating what sort of government they intend to form. So this meeting is really to provide some sort of analysis as well as make sense of the situation. And we've got three speakers for today. One is Ismail Vadi, who will be the first speaker. He is an activist, former parliamentarian, former MEC for transport in Gauteng, as well as a senior research associate at UJ University. We've got Rakotsepetse Chikane, who's the deputy chair of the Defend Our Democracy National Committee board, but it's basically it serves as the board of the DOD. And he is also a lecturer at the Wits School of Governance, as well as an author. And then we've got Nicole Fritz, who's also on Defend Our Democracy's National Committee. Nicole Fritz was the former executive director at the Helen Suzman Foundation and is a human rights lawyer as well. So we know that this is a critical point in the country, and it's really determining what the next couple of years look like in terms of the overall politics, our economics, as well as the overall stability of the country. So thank you all for joining in, and we're now going to hand over to our speakers. We will have the speakers open up for question and answer. But in the meanwhile, we encourage you to put all of your questions or comments in the chat, and we'll be directing those to the speakers. Just 1 or 2 house rules. Please ensure that your videos are off so that we save on bandwidth. And this meeting is being recorded, so it is a public meeting as well. Thanks once again for joining in. Ismail, over to you.
Aguilar, thank you very much. If Zinzi can just load on the presentation. Right, so thank you very much. I'll speak for about 15 or 20 minutes. I hope I can put everything through in the time that has been given to me. So the first thing that I think, Zinzi, can we go to the next slide? Next slide, please. Okay. Can you hear me? All right, so I think the first thing is that we are now entering uncharted waters or uncharted territory in the country. Since 1948 up to 2024, we've been experiencing single-party rule. From 1948 to 1994, it was National Party, although it was a racist party, which excluded the majority of people from government, but it was the dominant party in politics. And in a sense, it provided some form of stability in terms of governance. And from 1994 to 2024, the last 30 years, the ANC has been the dominant force within our body politic and has been the governing party. We obviously now faced with a completely new situation in the country. No single party was able to get more than 50% in terms of the elections and the results that were announced on Sunday. And we now entering what we would say is something that's unprecedented in our country, at least in the last 50 years or so. So next slide, please, Zinzi. So we have what the people beautifully calls the V-size Big Five. ANC with 40%, DA with 22%, MK Party with 14.5%, the EFF with 9.5%, and the IFP with 4%, and then a string of about 10 or 13 other parties that are between 2 and 1%. So there'll be a total of 18 parties, but these are really the major parties that we now need to begin to see how they position themselves and how they would want to see the unfolding form of governance in our country. Zinzi, next slide, please. All right, so if there isn't a single majority party in our system, that means that some form of a coalition will have to be established. And I thought it was useful just to put down a basic sort of definition. A coalition government exists when 2 or more political parties, in our case, there might be some independent representatives, but I don't think so, combine their votes in parliament, the provincial legislature, or councils to elect a government and to support the decisions that such a government takes. This is necessary when no single party has a majority of the seats in these institutions. So that's really the reality now. And we are forced to construct some kind of a coalition government or even a minority government if there can't be a coalition of a majority. So last night, the ANC had announced that it would prefer a government of national unity. And I think it's important for us to also just understand the concept. It is part of a coalition arrangement, but it has a specific meaning. And in terms of the basic definitions, if you look at the literature, a government of national unity is formed by a broad coalition of parties. So it's not just 1 or 2, but a broad coalition of parties, especially in a time of national emergency. We're not facing that situation, or by choice, or when no single party enjoys a simple majority in a governing institution. So we are faced with that situation now when we don't have a simple majority in parliament or in government, and at least in in the 3 other legislatures at the provincial level. And the ANC announced last night that by virtue of choice and the fact that it is accepting the electoral outcome, it wants to now establish a government of national unity. The aim of such a government is to stabilize the country, particularly in situations of political deadlock, and I think that's where we are. We don't have civil conflict, thankfully, or we haven't experienced a major national disaster. And so by bringing together a wide range of political leaders, the GNU aims to foster cooperation and to ensure that critical decisions are made in a unified manner or with wider consensus in society. Now, it's not a completely new situation for us. We have experience of the last 30 years of a government of national unity and some kind of coalition government at the municipal level, at least in the last 5 to 7 years. Next slide, please. I thought it's important just to refresh our minds about what was the state of play in 1993, 1994. And of course, you know, many younger people will have got the catchphrase that 1994 represented a sellout option or highly compromised position. But many of them were not even born there or were little kids at that time and didn't understand the concrete material conditions, the dynamics of that particular moment, and what prompted the ANC to enter a government of national unity, even though it won the election convincingly in 1994. So I thought it was just useful to try and refresh our memories. And you'll see that this is in February. So Mandela was writing and he made a major presentation to the National Executive Committee of the ANC in February 1993. That's more than a year before the actual government of national unity was established. So it had a prolonged time to debate, to look at all the options, to bring its membership behind such a concept, all the diverse forces in society, etc. We don't have a year. We literally have 10 to 15 days in which a government of national unity will have to be established. So I think we must also have a sense of realism. We don't have time on our side, unlike in 1994. But actually what prompted the idea of a government of national unity in 1993 was that the ANC had prepared what was called a strategic perspectives document which looked at the balance of forces in the country and actually how to move forward. And those who supported the idea of a government of national unity motivated it in a particular way or understood the dynamics of the conjuncture in a particular way. The first important point was that even though it had a good sense that it was going to win the elections, but it always faced a prospect of counter-revolution and significant destabilization once there was a transition to a democratic order. And if we can remember the late 1980s and early 1990s, the violence in KZN, what was called the black on black violence, the violence on the East Rand and other parts of the country, conflict between UDF and Inkatha, ANC and Inkatha, conflict between townships and youth and the security services, etc. We were in an unstable political environment. And when for the first time, you want to transition to a new order, there's anxiety amongst various social forces in society. And so those that said that, look, we want to stabilize the country, we don't want a counter-revolution, and also that there was a deteriorating social and economic situation at that particular point in time. And Mandela, I mean, in that NEC meeting, I'm just going to read a quotation for you. The majority party, so they expected that the ANC would win, the majority party in the forthcoming election cannot alone effectively address the enormous problems facing the country. And what were those? The declining economy, the unacceptably high levels of unemployment and crime, the violence, which is likely to assume even more disturbing dimensions once a democratic government is installed. So political instability can only be successfully solved through a government of national unity. Only political stability rising out of such a government can attract investments. So that was the analysis. And then I think the last point, important point that was made in 1993, was in the strategic perspective document, that one needed to forestall potential threats to a new democracy that could come from the security forces and the civil service of the time. These institutions had the capacity not only to destabilize democracy, but also to delay or subvert the transition to a democratic order. And if the transition to democracy had only negative implications for the individuals who belong to them, that could feed the forces seeking to destabilize the country. So it was the concrete material conditions, the balance of power, and a sober and objective assessment of that particular conjuncture that prompted the ANC voluntarily in 1994 to go for a government of national unity, which some young people at least think was the sellout of the day. So 1994 to 1996, we were governed by an interim constitution, and the modalities of this government of national unity was embedded in the interim constitution. And in a sense, it said that any party which enjoyed 5% or more support, so there was a threshold of 5%, and those parties could constitute a government, and the ANC National Party and IFP qualified. And so we had Mandela as president, de Klerk as deputy president, and a sharing of the seats in the cabinet. And what is important also to understand is that even though the National Party withdrew from the government of national unity 2 years later, some form of a government of national unity continued under the Mbeki era, where the ANC, IFP, and AZAPO, and I don't know if there was any other party, my memory is also failing me, but they were represented in a government of national unity. And even in the last cabinet, I mean, we had Good Party, Patricia de Lille part of the government. So we've got some experience. The context is different. The moment is different. There we had an ANC majority that voluntarily chose to form a government of national unity. And of course, now we don't have such a majority party at all. Next slide, please. Next slide, Zinzi. Next slide, please. All right. Then in the last few years, we've had coalitions of different types in the municipalities, and there are about 80 municipalities in the country where we've got different kinds of coalitions that have been structured between the ANC and other parties and the DA, etc. Now, the MISTRA has just released a publication recently, which it calls Marriages of Inconvenience, and people can download it. It's available. But the key findings, and these really deal with coalitions in municipalities or in the third sphere of government. But there are important findings. One is that coalition governments are a product of people's will in democratic systems. So we have now in this election a kind of splashboard of support across different political parties with no single winner. What they say is that the current experiences of coalitions in municipalities have got certain inbuilt and inherent weaknesses, which have to be addressed to stabilize any form of coalition in the municipal sphere. And one of the things they put in forward is rather than having an executive mayor, we might want to go for a municipal executive system so that parties share power in the cabinet or the ruling sort of wing of the council led by a mayor. Two, is the very important third point there is that a new party political culture needs to be fostered and entrenched that do not treat coalitions as substitutes for electoral contests. I think what we're seeing now is just an immaturity in terms of the leadership, largely in the metropolitan municipalities and perhaps in some of the other municipalities, You have, votes of no confidence every 9 months to 12 months. The speaker is removed, the mayor is removed. There's just inbuilt instability in the systems, and that's because there's an absence of political maturity. People don't know why they're there and how to manage a coalition. And that was the will of the people, to try and to spread that power in the municipal level. And so parties are trying to topple a coalition force or to bring themselves into positions. And it's largely driven by personal interests, musical chairs, who will trade which portfolio, who will get which position. There's nothing about the public interest there. So that political culture is wrong. It starts on a wrong footing, and therefore you find that many of these municipalities are actually in shambles at the moment, particularly in the metropolitan municipalities. If you look at Joburg, Ekurhuleni, and Tshwane, for example. So the recommendations there also is the political parties should ensure that coalition agreements are formally negotiated. They must be binding for a particular period of time so that you don't have, like in Joburg, 9 mayors in 7 years or something like that. The agreements must be publicly released. There must be transparency. And we need to know what's the public interest that drives a particular coalition. What's the benefit to ordinary citizens? So public accountability must be encouraged rather than backroom bartering of public goods for personal and or party political gains. So coalitions are not permanent government institutions. That's another thing to remember now. You enter a coalition for a particular period of time. If it works, you might want to continue with it, or a new election will have to be called. And if it doesn't work, well, then the new election has to be called. But if it works, you might decide to continue with it. And there are positives and upside and downside to these kinds of things. But the conclusion is that you can optimize the value of coalitions, and this can be done if there's some kind of a legislative framework, particularly at municipal levels, but I would say even at provincial and national level, which regulates in broad terms how coalitions should be structured if there isn't a simple winner. And that's one of the things that we're going to have to look at as a country, what kind of legislative reform we would want, which will begin to regulate the whole notion of coalition governments in our country. Zinzi, next slide, please. All right, so in the last 10 days or so, there's been a lot of debate and discussion and widely differing views about what kind of coalitions should be formed, who should be part of it, who should be in and out of the process, etc. And I'm not going to pass judgment on any one of those, but we can broadly categorize 4 kinds of coalitions that people have been advocating, depending on where you are in society and which social or racial class or social class that you subscribe to and what's your ideological orientation. So we've seen, the first kind of notion that's emerging is ideologically based coalitions with a leftist orientation. So the SACP, for example, has said they don't want any coalition with the D8 and DA, and they're calling it all sorts of names. They say it's an anti-ANC, neoliberal forces, and MKP that represents factionalism, state capture, and resistance to accountability. And the SACP calls for an ANC-headed alliance coalition with a developmental agenda and working class mobilization. Similarly, the COSATU has indicated no coalition with the DA. NUMSA yesterday said a DA coalition will be the final betrayal of a working class. And so you see more leftist sort of organizations are saying a coalition is possible, but they don't want it with the DA, maybe not with the Freedom Front Plus or any white sort of dominant party. So they're probably looking for a coalition of black parties, if I put it in a more crude way. If you look at the bottom, there's the possibility of a populist coalition with a degree of political stability and low economic growth. So this is the option if the ANC goes for EFF, MKP, PA as a coalition partners. So it's largely black, supported parties. But I think that this will have serious, it might stabilize the political situation in some ways, particularly in KZN. But I think it would have disastrous consequences for our economy, for investor confidence, and there'll be serious issues about the future of the constitutional democracy, constitutionalism, the rule of law, whether public resources will be judiciously used and utilized. There would be limited or no accountability, and there might be ill-considered, seemingly radical populist policies, particularly at an economic level, and we might see a gradual and progressive breakdown of democratic culture and norms. So that's an option that's there, and people must know if we go for that option, well, that's the consequences you might face. Then we've got the idea of a government of national unity, which now the ANC is put forward as the preferred option. This will guarantee a degree of political stability and perhaps some amount of economic certainty in the short term. And here you could have any number of permutations, an ANC-DA coalition only, nationally, and an ANC-DA-IFP coalition with smaller parties in the provinces, particularly in KZN and in Gauteng. Or it might be what the ANC announced early yesterday morning. They are in discussions with the ANC, DA, IFP, PA, and NFP as possible coalition partners nationally and provincially. Or it could be a broader-based coalition with a wider range of parties, particularly a number of other smaller parties that are not in the discourse at the moment. Or, as I said, a wider coalition which excludes the EFF and MKP, but it brings in the ANC, DA, IFP as the major players, as the stabilizing forces, and then you bring in a whole number of smaller parties like the Good Party, Al-Jamaa, Rising Mzansi, etc. There's a whole long list of them, PA, etc. So there's any number of permutations, and yeah, it really depends now on who's likely to be in or out, and I'll talk to that later on. And then there is this idea of a no lesion or no coalition at all, a minority government, which they use the term confidence and supply model. So the Free Market Foundation has now publicly said they wouldn't want or they wouldn't support the idea of a coalition. They would prefer a minority government with no construction of artificial majoritarian regime. So the other parties, the other bigger parties, will guarantee that the president and deputy president will be elected, and a cabinet will be established, and that they wouldn't pass a vote of no confidence, and the portfolios in parliament will be filled, and similarly in the provincial legislatures. But once the government is established, then on any policy matter or any legislative matter, it will be addressed on a case-by-case basis, and it will mean negotiations, compromises, depending on what the issues are. So if it's NHI, for example, well, each party will come to parliament and try and persuade the other and see whether they can pass that legislation in that regard. And if they can't get consensus, then obviously that legislation will be done. So it's a minority government, and then significant ongoing consultation, negotiation, and persuasion and compromises. All right, so put it crudely, the one on the red there is more of the same with a leftist shift. The one on the right in blue is more of the Mandela Mbeki era. The green at the bottom is perhaps more of the Zuma era. And the one in the yellow on the right-hand bottom, it's something that we have not experimented with, and it's untested. But these are in broad terms, the options that are on the table. And we now need to see, which is the best way, or the parties have to see which is the best way forward. Next slide, please. All right, now, what is important is that, like that slide I showed in 1993, that I spoke to earlier on, in making these choices, whatever choice you go for, whatever form and composition of the government of national unity, it must be based on a real understanding, a deep understanding of the concrete material conditions. It can't just be ideological. One needs to understand where society is, what are its challenges, what are the inbuilt contradictions in the society, what are the play of political and social forces, What are the risks to democracy and to the constitutional order? All of those things, what's the state of the economy? What's the mood of the populace? Is there restiveness? Is there uncertainty? Is there demoralization amongst people in the idea of democracy? All of those things have to be weighed up, and then you make choices. It's not an arbitrary thing. And in the week, I mean, Mac Maharaj came out, I think, with a very useful 3 or 4 page sort of, I wouldn't say, but just his thoughts. And I thought it was important just to summarize it for us because it was so crisp and clear. And you can see the richness of his experience of the 1992, 93, 94 period. And I just fleshed it out. I'm not saying this is necessarily the answer, but I think it allows us to get some kind of a mapping. So Max says that, I mean, this moment demands strategic thinking. And that what he means by that, steadfastness to principle and goals. What are your principles? What are your short-term, medium-term, and long-term goals? At the same time, you need tactical acumen, flexibility adapted to the current terrain and the current circumstances. 2, the ANC must act in the interest of the country as a whole. It can't be partisan. It can't be sectarian. It can't appeal, or it shouldn't appeal only to a particular constituency. And he puts it very nicely, the ANC must stay unfalteringly the champion of the interests of all the people. It should position itself as the force in society which can carry the broadest range of society, or the bigger part of the middle ground behind its vision and its position for order and stability in the country. 3, we must define what is the national interest now. So what is it that we want to achieve in the next 5 years, at least, if we can't project beyond that? And what are the deliverables in relation to the national interest over the next 5 years? These should be made public. There should be transparency about it, so that whatever form of government is ultimately constructed, we should be able to assess its performance annually. You can't leave it to chance and just hope that a GNU will function and it will eventually reach its goals. It must define its short-term goals. It must make that public, and we should be able to measure progress in relation to those goals. And then he puts down some broad principles, a commitment to constitutionalism and constitutional values. He says there must be stable government that eschews opportunistic distribution of political office like we've seen in the municipalities. We must address the major infrastructure backlogs in the country. That's energy, transport, water, sanitation, education, and healthcare. We must ensure that the state-owned entities are now going to be functional over the next few years, and there's competent appointments, capable people appointed who've got the requisite skills, and not just political appointees with some ulterior motive in mind. We've got to take a clear stance on corruption. And then there must be an economic growth path. I mean, we're sitting on 1% growth with massive unemployment, massive inequality in society. And if you don't address that, any political configuration is not going to solve your problem. And so we must need a 5-year plan to kickstart the economy, to start creating jobs, and to reduce poverty and inequality in society. And these should be reduced to writing with clearly framed annual targets, with reporting to Parliament and the public at large, or in the nation at large. Next slide, please. All right, so yesterday we felt a little bit like this. We didn't know which way things are going. And I can tell you there's anxiety. I mean, if I just look within my own family and people that you talk to, people don't know what's going to happen in this country. There is a sense of uncertainty. And I think people want some kind of assurance that there would be a stable transition, an orderly transition, nothing like the July 2021 unrest and attempted insurrection and those kinds of things. So there is genuine concern. And if you look at some of the ENCA, I think, had a Mark Data report yesterday, that across political parties, more than 70% of people want some kind of coalition government because they think it will ensure stability in the short term. Next slide, please. All right. So last night's late night address to the NEC by the president, I think, sets down the broad sort of parameters in broad brushstrokes about what we should be looking at. And I must say, at a personal level, it was assuring. It was a very matured response. And it was a dignified response to a situation where a ruling party loses power. In many other countries, for example, on the African continent, you are out into disputes, into serious civil strife, etc. The fact that the ANC has accepted the outcome, I think, is a very important political statement, that you accept the will of the people. That's the essence of the democratic process. So what were the broad sort of, people have obviously read the speech, and I'll just sort of flesh out the big points there. The current moment demands the broadest unity among South Africans. That's important. There's a need for multi-party cooperation, multi-party stakeholder collaboration to overcome the challenges that confront our country. Underpinning this is the idea of a more mature leadership, because with an immature leadership, you can't achieve that. The GNU is the most viable, effective, and powerful way to meet the expectations of our people. Its purpose will be to tackle pressing issues such as job creation and inclusive economic growth, the high cost of living, service delivery, crime, and corruption. So there, the ANC is putting out what would be the baseline sort of, or the pillars of a new program of action. These are the things that we need to consider. Guiding principles: advance the creation of a united, democratic, non-racial, non-sexist, and prosperous nation. And this is a very important point, this idea of a united, democratic, non-racial society. I hear some voices calling for now a kingdom of Zululand, an independent kingdom of Zululand. Technically, that means that there are some people, considering secession. That means to break up the national sovereignty of this country. That will lead to massive civil strife. So we mustn't take these things lightly. The idea of a united, single, sovereign South African state is a very fundamental principle. And people must not play with issues of secession, because that will implode this country. Coalition partners must commit to shared values, nation building, and social cohesion. What are those values? Respect for the Constitution. So that's a fundamental principle, because at least one party is saying, well, scrap the Constitution, Parliament should be sovereign. So those are very fundamental differences. You can't just say, willy-nilly bring them into the coalition, and then one party subscribes to the Constitution and the other is trying to undermine and remove the Constitution from our body politic. Respect for the rule of law is a very fundamental principle of any democracy and for any legal judicial system, and for order in society. You can't have one law for one person and another law for another person, or one law for big leaders and another law for ordinary citizens. Social justice and equity, human dignity, non-racialism, non-sexism, these are fundamental principles. And then the point I was making earlier, there's a need for stability in the country, for accountability, for transparency, for integrity. And then an important point, community participation. If political parties, which are really, they represent political elites, you need to carry the nation with you. You need to get grassroots participation and buy-in into the process. So this consultation with the populace at large and civil society organizations, etc., are critical. And then good governance. Agreements must be in writing, should be public. They must be transparent and include measures of holding parties accountable. Similar approaches will be used for the provincial governments. And then they announced, of course, that they met with the following parties to discuss such a coalition government, and they're keeping the doors open for other parties. And then it said that they're proposing a national dialogue. The terms of reference remains undefined. It's just a concept that's out there. Who is the national dialogue, with whom, how, when, etc., we're not too sure at this stage, but it's an important concept to make sure that there's broad support or national support for whatever initiative is finally agreed upon. And today we now had the IFP in principle supporting the idea of a GNU. The DA has indicated, of course, that in principle it's agreed. It depends on the minor details. Interestingly, Rais Mzansi also said that they're open to the idea, but nobody has really spoken to them, but they have expressed some interest in further discussion. The EFF, I don't know if there's an official position, but we've had contradictory kind of comments coming from Malema and Floyd Shivambu. I don't know if it represents party positions, but it's not, at this stage, it's not too clear what their formal position is. The MKP has indicated that they've had some discussion with the ANC, although yesterday Fikile Mbalula was saying that they're not getting any response from MKP. So one doesn't know, where those discussions are, what's the substance of it. And then, of course, Action South Africa has indicated formally that they're not going to participate. So, UDM, Freedom Front Plus, all the other smaller parties also have not professed on the matter. All right, what's the next practical steps?
Running out of time. So
this is the last slide. This is the last slide. I'm sorry, I'm taking a bit more time. Okay, so as I said, we don't have 1 year like in 1993. We've literally got 10 or 15 days to begin to knuckle down some kind of an agreement and to establish the government of national unity. So step one, in the shortest possible time, we need confirmation from parties who wish to participate. I think we can't now be wait and see. People must say, we're in the process or we're out of the process. I think parties need to pronounce on that. Two, once that is done, they need to agree on the principles and the underlying values, the modalities and the terms of power sharing. So there was a suggestion that we heard sometime last week that something like the DA was saying, we don't want to be in the cabinet, in the national cabinet, but be prepared to consider taking all the positions in parliament. So that's what I mean by modality. You might not want to be in the cabinet, in the government at large, but you might want to occupy positions in another component or arm of government. So those things need to be cleared up in the shortest possible time. Then, of course, there must be agreement on who would be the president and deputy president, and the suggestion of 2 presidents again rather than 1. Who would be the premiers, at least in those provinces where there isn't a majority? How will you allocate cabinet positions and provincial MEC positions? What would be the formula? And who's in and who's out and who gets seats? And then allocation of all positions in parliament and the legislatures: speaker, deputy speaker, chief whips, chair of committees, leader of the opposition, chair of portfolio committees. And then you must hammer out or announce what would be the broad goals of a government of national unity over the 5 years, both nationally and in each province. They must sign binding agreements with clear-cut timeframes. Is this a 5-year agreement? Is it a 2.5-year or 3-year agreement? Those need to be spelled out and they must be publicized. And then once those things are done, you start getting to the formalities where members of parliament and legislatures are sworn in, speaker and president premiers are elected, the inauguration ceremonies take place, a cabinet is appointed nationally and provincially. I'm just raising this now. There must be something for a deadlock breaking mechanism. So let's say if they don't agree on the next 5 days. Is it at the moment each party is appointing a negotiating team, and you see party leaders are not part of it. So supposedly it will mean that if there's a deadlock among the negotiating teams, the party leaders will probably come together and see whether they can come to some sort of an agreement and clear out the edges. And if not, will there be a need for some outside facilitators? It's possible. And then we must make sure that at least in the short term that we maintain national and provincial stability. So if there are any forces that are aiming to destabilize society in the next few weeks, they must be dealt with firmly and squarely. We must maintain public trust and confidence, and therefore carry the people with you and retain investor confidence and market stability. Last point, last slide, please. I'm not going to be long, Zakira. I know you're getting a bit edgy. Okay, I'm just raising an issue. What is the position of civil society? So what's the position of people that are here in various groups in this forum? Are you just an interested observer, a passive onlooker, or active participant in this process? Will society want to be represented in this national dialogue if and when it takes place? And if you say yes, civil society should be represented, what will you do there? And what will you say? Are you just going to go there as an observer? Or what is your position as civil society organizations of the movement? And already we've had some initial thoughts from other structures in civil society. COSATU and NUM I've already indicated. OTA has already issued a statement welcoming the outcome of the elections and calling for responsible coalition government. Free Market Foundation have indicated they support a minority government. CEF2 is convening a working class summit on the 12th of June, that's next week. Center for Development Enterprise has announced a 5-point action plan for economic growth and transformation. Today, Business Unity South Africa has issued a statement. They support the idea of the GNU. Depends on who is in, so it's a qualification there. They want to see promotion of free market economy, respect for the constitution and rule of law, recognition of the role of private sector in development. So I want to end off then, and sorry for taking so much of time. What is the position of the Defend Our Democracy and its member organizations or affiliated organizations? And how do you want to impact on this process? Thank you very much, Zakira.
Thanks for that. We are running short of time, so I'm going to ask Nicole Fritz to come in, and thereafter will be followed by Rekhotsefetse Chikane. Nicole?
Thanks, Akira. Good afternoon to everyone. I've been tasked with providing an overview of legal requirements relevant to this particular moment. I'm going to look briefly at electoral disputes, at the composition of the National Assembly, its first sitting, and the election of various officials. And then I'm going to look at what may be relevant to a government of national unity, coalition government. But I stress that it is very much an overview and is not an exhaustive treatment. So first, electoral disputes. We had heard that there had been a large number, nearing 600 objections that had been registered with the Electoral Commission. What must be made plain is that the Electoral Act provides that determination and declaration of the result of an election, which occurred on Sunday evening, as we saw, must occur within 7 days after the voting day, but not before all objections made under Section 55, and Section 55 permits any interested party to make an objection concerning any part of an election that is material to the final result. So not before all those objections have been dealt with by the Electoral Commission, other than those that are going on appeal to the Electoral Court. So in making the determination and declaration, we can make the conclusion that the Electoral Commission itself believes that it has dealt with the various objections lodged with it. But obviously, some of those objections will be going to the Electoral Court on appeal. And just to provide a brief description of the Electoral Court, the Electoral Court is established by the Electoral Commission Act of 1996 and is authorized to adjudicate electoral disputes and oversee the decisions of the Electoral Commission of South Africa. It has equal status to, but a more limited jurisdiction to, the High Courts. It hears appeals against decisions of the Electoral Commission concerning the application of electoral law. It also adjudicates electoral disputes on the counting of votes and breaches of the Electoral Code of Conduct, such as vote rigging. Because the court is of equal status to the High Court, its judgments are appealed to the Supreme Court of Appeal, but in exceptional cases may be appealed directly to the Constitutional Court. In certain disputes, such as a dispute over a vote count, the Electoral Court's decision is final and no appeal is allowed, even to the highest court in the land. The matter it adjudicates, the matters it adjudicates are inherently urgent, and this means that it must adjudicate them in the shortest time possible. It is worth noting that Section 49 of our Constitution envisages a situation where a court may set aside an election. In such a situation, where a court has set aside an election, the president, by proclamation, must call and set dates for another election within 90 days of the date on which the election was set aside. I certainly know of, and I stand to be corrected, but I know of no dispute which plausibly at this moment gives rise to a scenario where we might anticipate any court setting aside the results of these elections, and so another election having to be called. I don't anticipate that. I don't see that as a plausible, foreseeable outcome. Let me now turn to the first sitting of the National Assembly and the election of various officials. There's some dispute as to whether the National Assembly has to sit within 14 days of the election result having been determined and declared at the determination of the Chief Justice. There is some discussion as to whether that has to happen by Sunday, the 16th of June, or in fact would be Tuesday, the 18th of June. We'll know soon enough, I imagine, from the Chief Justice's office. There obviously has been some controversy in recent days in that the MK party has suggested that it will boycott or stay away from that first sitting, although as I've read recently, today MK has indicated to Clement Manyatela that all its members will in fact be present at that first sitting. It's hard to tell what store to place in such undertaking, but what is clear is that a stay away by MK representatives, or indeed the representatives of any other party, could not prevent the election of the president and other officials. I should say what will be interesting is the requirement that those who attend that sitting and assume their functions as members of the National Assembly are required to swear an oath, an oath of faithfulness to Parliament and of obedience to the Constitution. And this will obviously raise questions for members of the MK party, specifically in that they explicitly, their manifesto calls for a chucking out of our Constitution and for an installation of a system of parliamentary supremacy. But certainly in taking their seats in the National Assembly, they will be required to take that oath. But let me return to this question of whether of why staying away would not deter or prevent the first sitting or the election of these significant officials. Section 46 of the Constitution provides for the composition of the National Assembly and says that the National Assembly consists of no fewer than 350 and no more than 400 women and men elected as members in terms of our electoral system. But while it tells us about the composition, it tells us nothing about quorum for decisions. And it is worth contrasting here, or setting out provision 53 of the Constitution, which is titled Decisions, and which says, except where the Constitution provides otherwise, a majority of the members of the National Assembly must be present before a vote may be taken on a bill or an amendment to a bill, and at least 1/3 of the members must be present before a vote may be taken on any other question before the National Assembly. and all questions before the National Assembly are decided by a majority of the votes cast. In the case of the election of the President, which is set out in Section 86 of the Constitution, and of the Speaker and Deputy Speaker of the National Assembly, which is set out in Section 52 of the Constitution, the requirements for those for the elections of those officials, which must happen at the first sitting, at the first sitting of the National Assembly after its election, or wherever necessary to fill a vacancy, the National Assembly must elect a woman or man from among its members to be the President, Speaker, Deputy Speaker. The procedure is set out in Schedule 3 of the Constitution, and this requires that the member appointed to that post must receive a majority of the votes. A process of elimination is prescribed under Schedule 3 until such outcome is received, the outcome being a majority of the votes cast. So you will have a process of elimination if in a first round of voting, no single member nominated receives a majority of the votes, and you will carry on until the election results in the individual receiving a majority of the votes cast. It's worth contrasting with what the removal of the President requires. And here, what is required is a supporting vote of at least 2/3 of Parliament's members, not 2/3 of the votes cast. So you have to have 2/3 of Parliament's members in order to vote for the removal of the President. Interestingly, a motion of no confidence requires a vote of a majority of the National Assembly's members. And in circumstances of a vote of no confidence in the President, she or he, the Deputy President and members of the Cabinet must resign. Let me now turn to the Government of National Unity, coalition government arrangements that may be made for our next government. What is made plain is that our Constitution does not regulate the formation of a government of national unity or a coalition government. That is not to say that they aren't perfectly lawful, just that the Constitution has nothing specific to say about them. Its terms, its provisions can encompass and encapsulate the formation of a coalition or a government of national unity, but there are no specific explicit provisions that will regulate them. Instead, their terms and conditions are to be regulated and governed by agreement or contract. That said, without some explicit agreement between the ANC, which has received the largest share of the vote, and some other parties, whether through coalition agreement or confidence and supply agreement, the executive and the President especially will be particularly vulnerable to the risk of motions of no confidence, which, as I've already indicated, can be passed by a vote of a majority of the National Assembly's members. And Pierre de Vos brings to the fore an especially relevant consideration when he says, if Cyril Ramaphosa is re-elected as president at the first sitting of the National Assembly, Section 88 of the Constitution may become of pivotal importance when votes of no confidence are tabled. This is because Section 88, subsection 1 of the Constitution, states that the president's term of office begins on assuming office and ends upon a vacancy occurring, which means that if he is removed through a vote of no confidence after a few weeks or a few months in office, he would have served his second term and would not be eligible to be re-elected at a later date. And I think, as I said, that is something that would need to be borne in mind. I will leave it there, and I'm happy to take any questions in the chat section later.
Thanks for that, Nicole. As much as the moment presents a lot of anxiety and unknown factors, Rekhotsafetse Chikane will speak about some of the opportunities that the perhaps new configuration of government may present. So Rekhotsafetse, over to you.
Yeah, and Zaka, just how much time do you want me to go for?
I think if we can keep it to about 15 to 20 minutes, and then we can take some of the questions thereafter.
Much less than that. Okay, so thank you, everyone. I know it's been like a crazy time over the last little while. I don't have a presentation slide, but I can kind of follow as I go along. So we've entered like really exciting times. And I know there's a lot of like anxiety, rightfully so, about where the country is going to go, what our democratic outcomes will look like. But I do want to just highlight that it also opens up a huge amount of opportunities, especially for civil society, that we just didn't have before in any particular way. And that was mostly because of the dominance of the ANC, that in 80–90% of cases, if the ANC didn't want to listen to you, they didn't have to listen to you. And a lot of that used to be metered. So I'm going to start off by kind of talking about what traditionally used to happen in Parliament. Why I'm also excited about this is that I've been lecturing about coalitions at the Wits School of Governance for the last 4 years now. And now all this kind of like what we've been lecturing in terms of like theoretical things that might happen is now really going to come into reality, which is quite exciting. But it also means that theory can only kind of take you so far. And it gives us the opportunity as civil society to really create what the culture would be ourselves, right? So we are not reliant. We need to forge a culture of accountability within a coalition setup. And that is really our responsibility. Because, as I said before, traditionally the way the ANC approached civil society in government is that they would usually talk to their alliance partners. Back in the day when the ANC was a lot more open to organizations outside of the ANC, there was a lot of engagement with broader civil society around particular issues. That space essentially shut down during the early 2000s into the mid 2000s as the ANC's internal kind of democracy started changing. And what you ended up having is that the ANC became a lot more antagonistic towards civil society that would criticize the ANC, and not necessarily criticize the ANC as a party, but would criticize particular policy positions. You start seeing this from the Treatment Action Campaign going forward, and essentially created a more kind of antagonistic role outside of a few organizations. And an easy way to kind of see this playing out is asking yourself the question of all the times in which you submitted public comments to Parliament. Just ask yourself how often your public comments were taken without you putting up a fight, right? That even if it was evidence-based with extremely good rationale, how often your views would be taken into consideration as well as put into legislation. And we've seen that trend essentially drop as time has gone on, that the amount of public comments given doesn't necessarily translate into legislation created. And that's because when you have such a strong majority, you don't need to do that in any particular way. And obviously there are particular cases in which this is not the case, particular instances of particular civil society organizations that successfully campaign. So we're thinking about the secrecy bill, for instance, would be a really good example of that in recent times. But since then, it's really been quite confrontational with Parliament and with the executive. So I was going to talk about different types of coalitions, but I think we've kind of talked that out. But what I would want everyone to really look out for. So when we do think about coalitions, generally there are 3 types of coalitions that will form. So we might call this a government of national unity, but there's a very important difference, which is a bit obvious when you think about it, between the current attempt to create a GNU vis-a-vis the old government of national unity. So in the old version, the ANC had a firm majority in the country, right? That you could create a government of national unity, but the ANC was still in power. It wasn't that it needed other people. It needed other people in order to cause peace and stability, but not necessarily policy stability per se. The major difference now is that you have a government of national unity in which the ANC can't just dictate what will happen in one way or another, right? So it does necessitate a different way of thinking about what this unity means. It also means that it's another term for a coalition, right? Regardless of what you call it, it is still a coalition in its broader sense, in which it is, you can't get your policy over the line. So that leads us to the next question of, well, if it is essentially just a coalition, we then ask two questions. The first is, and we need to look out for this, is this coalition a office-seeking coalition? So we're only in power with each other in order to make sure we get into office and certain positions are distributed, right? Regardless of whether we are ideologically aligned with each other, right? So it doesn't matter if we agree on broader principles around policy. Our primary goal is to just get us over the line. The other form of coalition that we'll see is asking the question about, is this coalition aligned ideologically? And what that essentially means is that the scope for influencing, right, the scope for influencing policy becomes a lot more limited, right? So if you have a policy rationale for a coalition, so we're ideologically linked, it means that the parties essentially say, we agree on the major issues and we'll push a policy agenda going on the major issues. And we agree to disagree on particular minor issues. And generally that's how coalitions across the world will go, if they're kind of policy rationale coalitions. And it'll be very interesting to see what the final outlook looks like, because it informs the type of advocacy that civil society can make. Essentially, if we know these particular areas where ideologically, even though we're all in the same kind of broad church, but these particular instances where we differ, there is scope to start influencing particular organizations in that area. So we need to be on the lookout about what is the configuration of this. Is it simply was distributing seats in parliament? Is it cabinet positions? Is it particular standing committees in parliament? But I'll come back to that issue just now. What we also know is that, and we are unfortunate, ideally, because the parties only have a couple of days to negotiate this, it is unlikely that the parties will be able to negotiate on a long-standing legislative agenda, right? They'll probably talk about the big things, but they won't talk about what would ideally be our legislative year, and what are the issues we'll tackle in year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, year 5, right? With a post-electoral coalition with only 14 days to negotiate, it means that we can only come to agreement on some certain key things, and most of those will most likely be policy positions. And that essentially opens up the window of opportunity for civil society to start getting involved in a host of all other issues on the table that would not ordinarily be discussed in the coalition. Now, I believe we'll get some sort of public statement on a coalition agreement. I'm not holding my breath on it because there's no requirement by law, the last time I checked, for the coalitions to publicize the agreement. It would have to come out of the goodness of their heart, or a particular party publicizes it themselves. But once that agreement is made, there is a need for us to then look at that agreement and essentially say what has been agreed upon and what hasn't been agreed upon. What are the issues that we can then start highlighting that are not on the agenda that civil society wants to put on the agenda? So, for instance, let's say on the agenda was not the eradication of pit latrines, right? Because it's not on the agenda of the political parties, it creates the scope for civil society to then start advocating for that or your particular organization's concerns. So we need to start thinking about that, about what these coalition agreements look like, what do they not look like? What ideally we should be advocating for, and Ishmael had kind of talked about this and Nicole mentioned it slightly, around this notion of kind of confidence in supply, which is going to become quite useful to us. All of this doesn't matter if whatever coalition is created does not come to some sort of agreement about what would it take to create a motion of no confidence in the president. If there's no firm agreement and dispute resolution on that, anything we do would just be thrown out the window because it would just be complete chaos. But the flip side of this, so putting aside confidence, where civil society can get involved for the first time in democratic South Africa, is determining the budget. So a lot of people don't know that technically, National Treasury presents a budget that Parliament must essentially vote on. Now, because the ANC had such a firm majority, there was no need to really quibble about the budget. It would just be voted in. But there's now increased scope for political parties to influence the budget of the country. And because of that, it gives civil society increased influence to influence, or increased power to influence the budget making of the country. Now, it will most likely not happen during this first kind of 6 months. It most likely will start happening in the lead up to next year's budget speech. But it gives us this runway for the next year and a half to start thinking about what would civil society's role be in influencing the national budget of the country going from 2026 onwards, right? And potentially into the future if we stay in like this coalition way and no party wins a majority going forward. And that's a huge amount of influence. And I'm not entirely sure how civil society gets into that game because we've never had the opportunity to do it. But there's a few strategies that kind of open it up. So I'll start off with kind of our influence over cabinet, so the executive, and then our influence over the legislature. And we need to decide, or you need to decide, which one kind of fits your needs best. So within the cabinet, regardless of the outcome, to influence cabinet's decisions after policies come out of Parliament would be very, very hard. But there's an opportunity that opens up about how do you influence policy before it even gets to Parliament. So technically on paper, you would need the executive to kind of suggest their policy to Parliament. Parliament then goes off and does public commentary, and then it goes through a whole kind of loop within Parliament. People vote on it, and then it comes back to the executive to implement. Before, the scope to influence the executive's thinking about a policy was extremely limited to just parliamentary procedures. But if a particular minister believes that whatever they're suggesting might not have the support of the coalition, or there might be differences within the coalition about how they want to go about a particular policy. So let's think about mining rights off the coast of the Eastern Cape, or fracking rights within the Northern Cape. The scope for civil society to start influencing cabinet at that point, underneath the assumption that, or the argument that, we will convince other parties in Parliament to block you in Parliament. So you may as well listen to us now. I hope that makes sense, that we have opened up a new window to start influencing policy even before it gets to Parliament. Now that also creates, which something people aren't talking about all that much, for civil society in particular, it creates a brand new threat we haven't had to think about in a serious way inside Parliament and in a very open way. That it opens up the space for lobby groups within South Africa to come out of the shadows. So in the past, we don't have proper legislation around like how lobby groups function, and there was no need for it because the ANC was quite dominant. But in this day and age, the ability for, let's say you have a government of national unity, the DA decides not to participate, so you just have the ANC, EFF, and IFP. It creates a huge amount of pressure for the IFP to resist temptation from business that will say, we will give you a ton of money if you vote in this direction on this particular issue, right? So not like the big issues, but like particular issues like mining rights in the Eastern Cape or off the coast of the Eastern Cape, right? That big business is probably so happy right now, which is probably why they're asking for confidence in supply. It opens up the space for them to not have to talk to just the ANC and try and convince the ANC. You can now start influencing multiple organizations within this coalition to try and get your views across. right? And that's where civil society needs to be in contention, both in the executive and legislature. I'll skip over the last thing here, just for time, but just on the legislature. So civil society will have like an interesting choice. I always use the phrase that civil society is not equal. There are some organizations that are just bigger than others, and then there's some organizations that are blue chip civil society, for lack of a better phrase, right? That just have a ton of money, a ton of influence, a ton of resources to plow into research, to hire staff, etc., etc. But there's a need to ask the question of two scenarios for civil society going into this administration. And it's really about, okay, are we either fragmented or unified? If we're fragmented, and there's no better option, they're just two different options with two different outcomes. So let's say if we're unified, the argument then becomes, can civil society then go to particular coalition members that this grouping of civil society ideologically agrees with, to essentially say, we will assist you in pushing this policy narrative or pushing this policy option within communities, within our structures, so long as you include our views, right? So we will give you this kind of ground level support, so you're not just talking to your electoral base, but we give you that broader institutional support from civil society. We see this taking place in different countries about civil society really kind of uniting around particular actors, but not necessarily selling your soul. You don't have to like campaign for a particular party, but you essentially advocate alongside a political party that has influence within a coalition on a particular issue, right? But that would require kind of united front to ensure that smaller organizations that don't have the types of resources that bigger organizations would can still get involved in the legislative process. Right, you can essentially assist coalition partners, right, the smaller ones. And my strategies here don't really kind of talk to, how do I say this, to the ANC in particular. But we've seen this approach being taken by Brazil, for instance, where Brazilian civil society really united around a particular issue without ever having to form an organization, but to essentially say, water will be the primary concern regardless of what happens, right? We've seen different countries in the global south that have these openings really bandy around particular issues to say, we have no interest in running for office, but we want you to have this particular issue in the country resolved, right? And that doesn't mean that all civil society needs to come together. You can have sectoral support so that, for instance, equal education doesn't function on its own, but it can get broader support from other organizations within the education space around key things that they want to push within that sector. And it really opens up that opportunity. The other approach is the kind of fragmented approach, and which is also equally as good. It gives you the scope to really start influencing particular issues on the budget immediately as you figure it out. It gives you scope to start pushing your own research agenda towards particular issues. So right now, if you take, for instance, the Institute for Economic Justice and their argument around the COVID-19 grant, in the past, their narrative would have to go solely to the ANC and hope that the ANC kind of changes its mind. But now it can push its narrative and its research and its resources towards a particular agenda that they want. They essentially you sell towards a particular party in one way or another. And we see that's generally the way civil society engages with coalitions at an international level. That doesn't mean that will become South Africa's approach, right? And like I said right at the beginning, we have the scope to really define how civil society engages in coalitions. But we can't engage in that exercise by sitting on the dike and seeing what the political parties decide and then just go with them, if that makes sense, right? The opening up of a competitive multi-party democracy in its truest definition is not only applicable to political parties, it is equally applicable to civil society as well. It also gives the responsibility of civil society to say, do you fight issues on your own or do you bring someone with you? The overall point, and this is the last thing that I'll say, is that you're not completely reliant on the ANC to pass legislation. It's an interesting way to think about it. And once you think about it that way, then it becomes the question of that, well, who else can we try and influence? You don't have to partner up with a party in any particular way, but what other stakeholders can we influence? And what does that influence mean as civil society? What we know from business, it'll be money, right? It'll be political support. It'll be about how we fund your party going forward. We're going to see an explosion of political funding. I can almost see that happening. But civil society doesn't have that raw financial muscle. So the question then becomes, how do we define influence in a coalition agreement or coalition government going forward? And the last thing I'll say is that we should really try and not be kind of prisoners of the moment of right now and the intrigue of right now, that there's also a need to start strategically thinking, whether as a collective organization or on your own, about what your influence will be over the next kind of 5 years. Will you ensure that there's always someone in parliament who's talking to political parties? Will you be submitting public comments and not just submitting to the committee, but submitting to political parties so that they support your comments in the parliamentary committee? Do you start influencing the way political parties think? How do we bring citizens' voices into the conversation in a space in which political parties don't have a culture of listening to society? Like, they say they do, but they don't have a culture of doing it. And I think that's very, very exciting for all of us going forward. And I'm keen to see how DOD in particular plays in this space, and all of you as we go into the next kind of 7th administration. Thanks.
Thanks, Rekhotsofetse. There's been a set of questions that have come through, and I'm going to pose them to each of the speakers. I'll do so collectively, just in the interest of time, and then you can choose from there what you'd like to focus on, and I'm going to give each speaker 5 minutes to round up. I see there are hands. I'm going to ask that questions please be posed in the chat, and they'll be directed to the speakers. So, Nicole, there's been a question around extension of time to negotiate a government of national unity. Is there now a 10-day limitation to it, given that 4 days may have already passed, or can there be an extension? Secondly, what happens if parties don't comply with whatever agreements that are then negotiated? So if there is a coalition agreement, is there some sort of legal action that can be taken by another party or individuals? Is the multi-party charter agreement dead? And lastly, what comes first, the dialogue or the government of national unity? Ismail, there's questions around, can there be a coalition excluding the ANC? Will provincial agreements be differently negotiated, or does the government of national unity set the tone for what takes place provincially? What happens when there is such a differentiation of policy? So on issues of health, on issues of foreign policy, on issues of BEE, how do parties negotiate those differences? And then there's a question around external facilitation, if there is a need to bring in either domestic or foreign facilitators to help negotiate agreements. And then Rekhotsofetse, is there a regulatory framework for civil society involvement in coalition agreements as it stands? So in the negotiation process and what follows thereafter, how do civil society organizations hold coalitions accountable? Several questions around there being a referendum, either political parties hosting a referendum for their own members, or some sort of a national referendum on the formation of a coalition. A comment about civil society participation in a national dialogue. How do we sort of motivate for this, and how do we build ground support for whatever positions are taken there? And then clarity around what is the difference between a government of national unity and a coalition? Is it one and the same, or is it different? And then just you based on the opportunities for people going forward, or civil society organizations. It's been a question that civil society has been ignored in terms of its submissions that it may have made to Parliament in the past. Why will this change now? And then perhaps an overall question for everyone to consider is that there are new members of Parliament, many of them who are, or several of them who are now quite young. And do you think that this will help build a youth-based agenda for the country that focuses on youth development? Is this likely to change? So each of you can come in on all of the issues set out, but I'm going to give you 5 minutes each so that we don't take up too much time, beyond the limits that were set for this meeting. So Nicole, I'm going to ask you to come in first, and then Ismail and then Rekod. Thanks.
Thanks, Akira. I just wanted to say, and look, all of this is kind of untested to a large extent, but my reading is that, well, what is clear is that the Constitution sets this kind of momentum once an election has happened, and that makes clear our Constitution derives its legitimacy from the will of the people, and essentially proceeds on the basis that once the people have spoken, they've given them their imprimatur, the organs of government must proceed from there with some haste. So you've got 7 days from when the election is held for a determination and a declaration of the election result, and then a 14-day period from that determination and declaration within which the first sitting of the National Assembly must take place. And at that first sitting, the order of business is the election of the president and the speaker and the deputy speaker. The election of the president, obviously, then to constitute your executive power, and from the election of the president, then his or her office having the power then to establish the cabinet, appoint the cabinet ministers, constitute the executive authority. And of course, it makes, as I said, it makes perfect sense within the justification and understanding of our Constitution, which is to give expression to the will of the people. But we stand at a present moment where the expression of the people's will is very different from what our Constitution, when it was first drafted, envisaged. No party has an over 50% majority, and there are going to have to be negotiations. And for stability and certainty, and in order to tackle the enormous social calamities that befall us, you want a government, whether that's a coalition government or a government of national unity, that fully appreciates those concerns and has ways of addressing them, and is not going to be mired in fighting and instability. And that is going to require time. And so I do think that there is time to be had, but it's post that first sitting of Parliament. And so you might have and ask the political parties, sort of as a sign, an expression of maturity, that they convene, that there is an agreement amongst, some of the parties to agree to the election of a president, so that executive authority can be constituted, agree to the election of the speaker and the deputy speaker. Those members might, don't necessarily have to come from the same party. They can come from different parties. But once that first sitting has been called, and the date and time of that is to be determined by the Chief Justice, but thereafter it is for the Assembly to determine the time and duration of its sittings and its recess periods. And so that Assembly, once constituted, I mean, certainly if there is a sort of majority, one could structure the Assembly, the sittings of the Assembly, to allow for for negotiations and deliberations around a government of national unity or a coalition government that has a really deep sense of what it wants to achieve, what it can achieve, and what it will need to do in order to achieve that. And so I think we can look to understand this trajectory as a sequential one, and not all being packaged and delivered by this first sitting of the National Assembly, whether that be on the 16th or the 18th of June. I'll leave it there if that's okay.
Thanks, Nicole. Ismail and then Rekhotsofetse.
Okay, so I'm not going to.
You're muted. Ismail, you're muted.
Actually, I'm not going to discuss the difference between a coalition and a government of national unity. It is in the presentation, and once it's distributed, people will be able to understand the difference. But the idea of a GNU is really a more broadly based government that will include definitely more than 2 or 3 parties in government. And the idea is to build a national consensus and to create a greater confidence in the new administration and to try and cover the middle ground in society. Whether these should be ideologically aligned or not, I mean, that's a question of who you choose as your partners. But I think what is quite clear is that between the ANC and DA, roughly 62 or 63% of society has voted for those 2 parties. That gives you some idea. And within that, you could add any other kind of combination. There was a question of whether a government could be constituted outside of the ANC. Well, if the ANC can't constitute a government, the other parties could try. But if you look at the spectrum of parties, I think it's nearly impossible for them to arrive at any kind of agreement. At least that's my understanding. So clearly, as the largest party, largest minority party, the ANC has taken the initiative. It will have the prerogative to establish the government of national unity and to try and cobble together a coalition of parties which will at least guarantee 51% of any vote or any critical vote, such as for the president and some of the portfolios in parliament, etc. I think it's important to understand that it's not a technical exercise. It's not a question of whether it's 51 or 62. We are in a moment when if we can achieve a government with broader consensus, with wider support, I think it will instill confidence. It will generate stability in the country. It will lay a platform for stable governance over the next 5 years. We don't want a repeat of what is happening in the metropolitan municipalities. We can see how things are beginning to collapse, for example, in the city of Johannesburg, and how at the end of it all, ordinary people are being shortchanged in terms of declining standards of service delivery, etc. We don't want such a scenario to be replicated provincially or nationally. And therefore, it's important that we apply our minds. We don't have all the time in the world. But if we think we can, we're not in a game of extending or building a wider tripartite alliance of the ANC, COSATU, and the SACP. Because that's what some people are asking for, a kind of ideological reorientation of parties, and it must be left-leaning. If you want to extend the tripartite alliance, go and look for your new allies and strengthen that component. But we're talking of governance, of stabilizing a government in a situation where governance could be unstable or might not be actually constituted. And in that situation, there will be a need for flexibility, for compromises. You rather take, 2 steps back and 1 step forward, rather than rushing into something only to find that is not a durable way forward. So it's really understanding the current moment and the balance of forces and acting in the broader interest of the country and not your particular ideological position or party position. I'll leave it there, Zakira.
Thanks for that, Rekhotsofetse. And maybe Rekhotsofetse, you want to take into account the last question that's posed there as well around what happens at the provincial level.
Yeah, I noted that down. Okay, so I'll be very quick. So if I don't give your question enough time, I apologize. So the big thing is there was a question around whether we have enough time, and I saw that in the chat. So generally coalitions so if you think about CODESA, for instance, that led to a GNU. CODESA took 2 years and it shut down once or twice, type of thing, right? That it takes time. For those who know, in Germany, it took them 6 months to create a coalition agreement, right? We only have 14 days. I'm pretty sure, and this is something the parties are aware of, every platform DoD is kind of created for engaging with political parties around coalitions. All the parties are fundamentally aware that 14 days is not enough, but they just didn't change it before the elections, which is crazy, right? So we don't have enough time, but what that means is that we'll most likely see an evolution of a coalition agreement. There'll be the initial one, and then they'll most likely around positions, the composition of parliament, in particular, like seats in parliament, as well as future iterations that deal, hopefully, with kind of policy issues, which leads to this thing about how do we hold people accountable? Well, the number one thing is that we need to learn our lessons from local metro coalitions that have fallen apart. We still till this day, and I stand to be corrected, don't know the coalition agreements, right? There needs to be a lot of pressure for all political parties to publicize their agreements. In this instance, it might be even arguing one of the smaller parties, there's no harm in leaking this in one way or another. Because if we don't know that, then we don't know where we're putting pressure. We don't know if there's a fall or a crack in the coalition, whether it's a valid reason based on the agreement or some party has gone against that agreement. We would have no idea. And that really speaks to a dispute mechanism within it. Is there a regulatory framework for coalition agreements? Absolutely none, which is very frustrating. I'll give the DA props here. Siviwe Gwarube, the chief whip of the DA, suggested this about 2 years ago in Parliament, put up a motion and was routinely ignored. And I think at the time the ANC didn't think this would happen, and rightfully so for them. But there is a need to create some sort of regulatory framework going forward, not just for national, but for provincial as well as local coalitions. At this point, the political parties have a disproportionate amount of say. And because there's no regulation, then there's no sort of referendum on the formation of a coalition. Our referendum on this issue was the elections. And it is unlikely the political parties would do this because it works against their self-interest, right? They wouldn't want to it's already tough negotiating with 5 or 6 other people, including 60 odd million South Africans or 38 odd million South Africans, which probably doesn't make sense for them. I think there's a need to push for civil society to be included in coalition dialogue. So there's the initial one, this initial agreement, and then future iterations of whatever the agreement looks like as they develop it as time goes on over the next couple of months. So we need to get involved in that. On the provincial considerations, we haven't talked about it, but so far we've talked about national government. The horse trading, so the giving and taking, will most likely happen at provincial government level. But it also opens up that scope. But I must really emphasize this point. Second last thing I'll say, Zakira, is there's a big difference between local government coalitions and national government coalitions. Local government coalitions, the scope to influence is limited to issues of service, if that makes sense, quite like service delivery issues. It's not linked to the broader framework in which governance functions, right? And that's the power and the influence that we have at a national level. That is the entire framework in which how the country functions, right? And because of that, it isn't particular to like a particular community in a particular area. It opens up the scope for influence across multiple different issues that are often coalesce and intermix. But we need to keep an eye on provinces as well, because the likely outcome is what we decide at a national level will most likely influence the province as a whole. So understanding those dynamics, who you can influence in a province, that logic is still the same. So the logic of influencing coalitions at a national level, ideally, at least on paper, should still be the same at a provincial level, maybe not so much at a local level. And that's a conversation for another day. On the youth base, where the new members come in, young people come in, new agenda around young people, I'll make one comment on that. We have now exited a period of South African history in which there was like a paternalistic relationship between the ruling party and civil society. This, we will listen to you when we want to, or we'll listen to you when we can, right? We've now exited that. And it needs like a complete kind of mental shift, in my mind at least. I could be alone in this, but a complete mental shift from civil society around how it engages with the state now. That you're not asking for permission anymore. In the past, we had to ask for permission. We would protest, but we're still asking for permission. And I think that is different in this day and age. And I think it opens up new opportunities. And I don't mean, when I say antagonistic, I don't mean like confrontational, like fighting, but it means that we can be a lot more antagonistic with the state, with the opportunity to actually win a fight. This also doesn't involve having to go with political parties. It could just be standing firm on particular issues and putting pressure on political parties to change their position. And now we don't need to focus on just one party. We have a litany of options, especially if they agree on some sort of government of national unity, that the argument is, in order for us to be unified, we need to deal with these issues that civil society is talking about. But again, it comes back to whether we have a strategic, united approach to this, or whether we're quite fragmented in our thinking about it. And I think I dealt with all the questions, Dr.
Thanks for that, Rekhotsofetse, Nicole, and Ismail. We have run out of time, so I just want to thank Nicole for the edit comment in the chat. That's appreciated. Clarity on the provincial issue. From the side of DoD, we will be making this webinar available. It is on YouTube, on our YouTube page, so you can have a look at it there. And we will share the link as well as all of the slide presentations as well. There was a question around whether Defend Our Democracy is engaging with other organizations on the futuristic role of civil society. This is all work in progress. I think as much as the current situation is somewhat new for political parties, it's new for society as a whole. And we will have to, I think, look at those new forms of accountability, the new forms of oversight that presents itself for civil society, and look at what are the options at hand, so that we, I think, have a bit more of a coherent and collective stance regarding accountability on issues that are affecting broader society as well. Lastly, I just want to thank everyone for attending. A number of organizations have put together their principled views on coalitions. So what are the kind of principles that should guide coalition making? You can look at the documents by My Vote Counts, by Mistra and others. There are other organizations who will take a more political stance on issues and be quite overt in terms of kind of coalitions that they will want to form. And I think individual organizations are going to have to make the decision on possibly what stance they take, but at the very least be looking at supporting the principal positions that have been put forward, some of which has been raised in this meeting as well. So thanks to everyone for attending, and hopefully at the end of the next 10 days, we'll have a country that is stable and that takes forward, I think, meeting the needs of all of the people of South Africa. So thank you very much for joining in.